Hello. Hi everybody. This is a direct reading to YouTube, so this is not live on Twitch right now. I just want to give you guys a little lay of the land of what's kind of going on. Sorry I look this is right after, just so referencing, this is right after I got my tattoo, got overworked, and I'm in a lot of pain. I'm doing okay, but it is really painful. Also, our shitty fucking ass neighbors are doing fireworks right now because it's getting, it's a Friday and it's just, every whatever. So Mountain is with us. So he is right here. You could kind of make out the outline of this guy. He right here. He yawning. He might boof. He might need me to let him out. Also, Slate's upstairs and he is boofing as well. So hopefully it doesn't interact too much with our episode, but we're going to do our best. So, hello everybody. I'm so excited to read these 3 chapters for you. I'm sorry that, again, I'm not in the best of conditions, but I don't think there's anything more calming that you can possibly do other than, reading, really. So I'm just going to get up the Manacled. Okay, so Manacled is a dark romance surrounding Draco and Hermione. It's from Harry Potter. There are extensive trigger warnings, so viewer discretion is advised. The trigger warnings are rape, mutilation, forced marriage, degradation, forced breeding, death, war, and suicide. Viewer discretion is advised. So, where are we at in our journey? So basically, this episode is going to be chapters 35, 36, and 37. And then also, just to sort of try to do a summary of where we're at in the story. I feel like I'm going to stop summarizing really book 1 only because I feel like at this point we're already almost halfway through book 2. So I'm just going to try to kind of focus on the major plot points sorry, they're doing fireworks. Of plot of volume 2. So Hermione at this point has been, a healer for the Order of Phoenix, their primary tool to really keep the Order and the Resistance alive. She sees the war from a very different vantage point. She sees it from a place of a lot of anguish, pain, loss, torture, and she has been really pushing for the Order to use retaliative, I don't know, sorry, my brain, retaliative, dark magic. And the more she pushes for Harry and Ron and the Order to use dark magic, the more isolated she becomes in her quest, the more alone she feels. During this time, the Order is given it's seemingly random and unexpected, maybe ally. Draco Malfoy, who up until this point has become almost like the right hand of Voldemort, wants to turncoat and wants to become a double agent, like Snape. And his only wishes or wants or needs or whatever you want to call it is that he wants Hermione during and after the war and a full pardon. We don't still at this point know his motivations. We don't know why he's doing the things that he's doing. We don't know why he wants Hermione. We don't understand what's specifically kind of going on and what he is hoping to achieve by this. But Hermione, without question, agrees. Sorry, I forgot to put the fire on. Sorry. Hermione agrees. She's willing to do anything to keep her friends who have become her family safe, even though she feels isolated and alone. So she and Malfoy agreed to meet together in a shack in the middle of the woods, alone. And during that time, he and her are really trying to suss each other out. She doesn't know what his motives are, and he doesn't really know or understand her at all, since he hasn't seen her since Dumbledore was assassinated by Draco, in basically the Deathly Hallows. So, during this time, Draco keeps sort of pushing her. She keeps pushing him. She's decided to take the mindset that he's lonely and that she can utilize that as a weapon and worm her way into him being something that he needs, is relying on, that he cares about. So she's taken the emotional manipulative tactic. His motives are super weird. He seems angry with her. He also seems very protective of her. And we find out that he gives Hermione a huge win for the Order. He tells Hermione that Voldemort's going to be out of town, and if you're going to try to hit these hospitals and the torture department of the Death Eaters, now is your time. So she does, and during that time, it's a major success for the Order. But Malfoy plays gravely for this, because the specific way he phrased it is, if this is the opportune moment for the Orders to do it, because the response will be less cohesive and slower. But what she didn't realize at the time is that it's his response would be less cohesive and slower. He would set them up for success by failing to do a good job for Voldemort. And by doing so, Voldemort carved blood ritual runes into his back, lots of them, so deep they went into his bone. They cannot heal. They emanate dark magic, and they are eating away at basically Draco's sanity and soul. And it's penance for his bad response to this thing that Voldemort hasn't suspected Draco's actually responsible for. And during this time, they have matching rings that he tries to summon her repeatedly, but she's so overwhelmed with trying to just help all of the victims that they've saved that she ignores him, and weeks go by. So by the time she finally sees him and sees the damage that's done, it's set. She really can't undo it. And then a very pivotal thing happens. We don't know what or where it came from or what it is so far, but Hermione has a pendant, an amulet that she wears, and she takes it off of her neck and she essentially puts it inside of Draco while she's trying to heal his back. And weirdly enough, it is successful. I wouldn't say successful. It seems to be helping. It seems to be slowing down the spread of the dark magic. Let's put it that way. We also see them having some real intimate moments that are deeper than like things we've seen in the past. And we see that he also weirdly apologizes. He acted really angrily at one point and was like trying to teach Hermione self-defense, and he like was singing her with hexes, and she thought he just got off on it. You know, he's a sadist, he just gets off on it. But then the very next time they saw each other, he apologized, and she cannot make out heads or tails what his motives are. And we also see Hermione really dealing with a deep sense of she is a pawn for Moody and Kingsley, that they will use her, drain her of every resource she can offer them until she's basically not even Hermione anymore. And there's also a really beautiful moment with Hermione by the creek where she places a stone on top of each other. It's a Japanese tradition, and each stone is for a person she cares about. And the last stone, she hesitated, but the last stone was for Draco, and she put a stone out for him. She doesn't know how or when, but something between them is brewing, and she's trying to resist it, but she doesn't even understand it fully yet. So I think that's pretty much everything. There's probably obviously stuff I'm forgetting, but that's what the past episodes are for. So we are going to do chapter 35. Let me make a note because I don't have my precious Addie here to tell me. So this is at, I don't know how you do this, 8 minutes and 59 seconds is when chapter 35 starts. So let's do that. So chapter 35, flashback 10, July 2002. Hermione felt paranoid the following Tuesday when she was foraging, but the journey passed again without incident. That morning, when she arrived at the shack, Draco was already there waiting. So, dueling, he said, spinning his wand in his right hand as she walked through the door. Hermione froze and blanched slightly. She had braced herself, reminded herself repeatedly that Draco would likely do something incredibly nasty to her as soon as he started feeling better. It was apparently his default method for maintaining distance between them. She'd healed him considerably more from his punishment than she had after his fight with a werewolf. If he regarded her as overstepping recently in the way she had been touching him, if the space between them really had narrowed, she had reminded herself that eventually he might do something horribly cruel to widen it again. She'd known. But walking into it still felt like being gutted. She dropped her eyes and forced her expression not to change. Right, she said. She dropped her bag by the door and warded it. His expression was cool and calculating as he stared at her from across the room. I want to see if your dodging and evading has improved, but I don't want to renervate you every minute. Hermione flinched faintly. Just don't hit my hands, she interrupted him. I can't work if you hit my hands again. His eyes narrowed with annoyance. Fuck off, Granger. I'm not intending to hex you, he snapped. He flicked his wand sharply toward her, and she felt liquid. She glanced down and found a large water droplet spattered against the back of her hand. I realize you consider me a total monster, he said fatly, but I do make a general habit of keeping my word. I presume water will not offend you? Hermione was still staring down at her hand in astonishment. Finally, she looked up at him and blushed. Sorry, she mumbled. Right. His expression was stiff. So, I'm primarily interested in seeing how you move. However, do try to land a hex on me, if you possibly can. He entered a very uncommitted dueling stance and waited for her to do the same. She did, and then bobbed her head slightly in a bow before she sent a jelly-like jinx towards him. He blocked it with the faintest flick of his right hand. He sent a dozen drops of water in her direction, and she easily blocked them with a non-verbal shield. She sent a series of stunners, and he blocked them without moving. Why are you so concerned with how I move when you never do? She inquired as she sent several leg lockers and jelly-like jinxes towards his feet. I'm not dueling, he said, shooting her a thin smile as he blocked her spells and caught her feet with several drops of water. Your shield is incomprehensive. Stop maintaining it and dodge, or make sure it's full body. She flushed and physically dodged the next 20 water droplets while shooting several mild hexes in his direction. You aren't even trying to hit me, he said, frowning. You do realize I basically duel for a living? I fight werewolves, your order, Death Eaters. Especially lately. Everyone in the Dark Lord's ranks thinks that my injury is an open invitation to try to steal my spot. Hermione nearly tripped and stared at him in horror. What? She said with a horrified gasp. If he were Harry or Ron, she'd be smacking him upside the head. He shot her squarely between the eyes with a drop of water. Focus, he barked before laying his hand across his brow in apparent despair, but still blocking the leg-locking jinx she shot. You're hopeless, Merlin. This is why you lot are losing. I'm a healer, she snapped defensively. If you wanted me to try harder at hexing you, you should have talked about how you enjoy killing Kniezel's kittens. Every night before I go to sleep, he deadpanned as he filled the air with shooting drops of water. The floor was growing littered with puddles. Are you really saying that you've been dueling? Hermione demanded. She stopped trying to jinx him and was simply staring at him in outrage while she knocked aside all the water he was sending towards her. Draco rolled his eyes. You may recall, I am a Death Eater, he said. I'm not at a loss at how this surprise... You may recall... I am a Death Eater, he said. I am at a loss as how this surprises you. You are injured. I assume there'd be some basic tenets of human decency even among Death Eaters. She was seething. Well, you'd be wrong. Despite its muggle origins, the Dark Lord is a firm believer in promoting the survival of the fittest. Hence, his aspiration to subjugate all muggles. If my chastisement leaves me vulnerable to overthrow, then I ostensibly deserve it. So, what? They just get to attack you whenever they want? She asked angrily, continuing to ward off the rainstorm he was directing at her. The entire floor was covered in water. Of course not, he said, his lips curling condescendingly. Constant infighting weakens military cohesion. There's a designated time each week before the Dark Lord, at which point challenges are permitted, and there are generally restrictions on killing or doing anything to permanently impair our usefulness. That is vile. The civilized man is a more experienced and wiser savage, Draco said. Hermione squinted at him in confusion. So how is it that you know Darwin and Thoreau? Oh, know thyself, know thy enemy, and you shall win 100 battles without loss, he said with a faint smirk. We savage Death Eaters do know how to read. The Dark Lord doesn't care what I do so long as I continue providing him victories. He sighed abruptly and stopped shooting water at her. You're really not even trying to hex me, are you? He asked in irritation as he banished the pool of water they were both standing in. Hermione flushed faintly. I've spent a lot of time trying to heal you. I don't want to make you fall, she admitted begrudgingly. You fucking moron, he said, glaring at her. Do you expect Death Eaters to extend the same courtesy to you? If you're injured on the ground, cursing you Sorry. Oh, I'm so sorry. Do you expect Death Eaters to extend the same courtesy to you? If you're injured on the ground, cursing you additionally would be funny. I think it's generally understood that I would be a pretty piss-poor Death Eater, she snapped. Obviously. But I would hope you could be pragmatic enough to duel competently. I can be pragmatic when it comes down to the line. I don't bulk. But I can't try to injure you right now. She bit her lip and looked away from him. She started. You've saved several hundred people now. There's a chance no one will ever know. And you were punished for it. So, I'm not going to try to hurt you. Not when you're already injured. She stood there awkwardly. He sighed and stared at her. There was a cold calculation to his expression as he stood considering her. Then a long silence. Did you know, Draco said in an airy tone after a minute, that I was there when the Creevy family was dragged out of hiding? Hermione couldn't have been more stunned if he just stepped up and backhanded her. She looked up at him sharply while he continued. 2 Muggle-born wizards from the same family. Quite an anomaly. They were considered high priority. The Dark Lord wanted their deaths spectacular. Hermione choked. The words died in her throat, swallowed by her rising horror. You should have heard how the Muggles screamed. Dear Aunt Bella had such a fondness for the Cruciatus. You recall how she drove the Longbottoms insane? She considered the Creevies her encore performance. The boys tried to bolt. Good little runners. Smart enough to know they couldn't save their parents. Hermione felt as though she'd been punched repeatedly. She tried to breathe, but her lungs wouldn't function. Her throat felt as though something were closing around it. Draco continued in a relentless voice. Of course, your order came eventually, but they were rather late. The father bit through his tongue and drowned in the blood. Bella cut out the mother's womb just in case the woman was still sane enough to understand what she was being punished for. While they were stringing her organs up around the parlor, I was sent to track down the boys. It was easy, since they were blubbering and trying to stay together. Putting them in the countryside miles from another farm was quite an oversight for 2 wizards who couldn't apparate. Then the littler one stepped in a badger hole and broke his leg. He started crawling through the grass. An easy target for a killing curse. The second person I cursed in the back with it. Hermione's wrist snapped forward without thinking as she shot a slicing hex at him. It grazed Malfoy's cheek. He didn't flinch as the blood welled up from the razor-fine cut and streamed down his face. He stepped towards her. You know, he said softly, the killing curse, it takes something out of you. It's not something just anyone can throw around. Not repeatedly. Colin could have kept running. If he had, he might still be alive today. But he stopped. For his dead brother, he stopped. Ran back, tried to drag the body with him. Did you? Hermione croaked, feeling as though she might die from the horror currently welling up inside her. Are you? Malfoy arched an eyebrow and smirked coldly down at her. Are you wanting to know if I'm the one responsible for that nightmare in your head? Hermione felt that if she opened her mouth again, she might vomit. Her wand was shaking in her fingers. She felt torn between a desire to scream and sob. She had never felt capable of crucioing someone. But as Malfoy closed in on her, his gray eyes were glinting. She was sure she'd mean it. No, he said softly, and Hermione started slightly. That was Dalava. He just invented it. He came specifically with the hope of testing it that day. But it's difficult to aim. Useless long range. You have to be within a foot of the target. If Colin had just run, he wouldn't have been hit with it. Hermione clamped her hands over her mouth and dropped to the floor with a muffled sob. Malfoy knelt down, forced her chin up, and stared coldly into her eyes. That is what Gryffindor sentiment looks like. All those noble ideas of not leaving people behind, not even the dead. Of not using the dark arts, of not hitting someone because they're already down, or trying to ascribe heroism to someone. When you people feel like believing in any of that, remember just how and why Colin died in front of you. You have no idea how many of your resistance fighters I've killed because they believed the lie that goodness is an advantage in war. He let go of her face and stood. If you don't learn to fight now, you will die. The fact that you haven't already been killed foraging is from the sheer benevolence of fate. I'm sure you are too pragmatic to continue relying on such a thing. If you have any sense whatsoever, I expect some true resolve from you next week. He dropped a roll of parchment beside her and apparated away. Hermione sat shaking on the damp floor of the shack for a long time. No one talked about Colin. Out of the combined consideration for both Hermione and Harry, the topic was assiduously avoided. Anything that even vaguely broached it was treated with utmost delicacy. After it happened, Hermione had hidden the memory in the recesses of her mind, and it had festered like a wound. Malfoy had come across it while teaching her occlumency. Having him drag it out and use the trauma to berate her was such a staggering blow. She felt as though she were going into physical shock from it. There were very few things that still felt sacred to Hermione. Not her body, not her soul, but Colin's death. It had always been such a private agony. It had driven her from her friends. It had taken her across Europe and back. It had driven her all the way into the shack in which she sat, all the way to Malfoy, who had used it to belittle the last pieces of herself that still remained. She pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes until they ached, trying to recenter herself. She was late for her shift in the hospital wing when she finally dragged herself from the floor and headed to Grimmauld Place. She felt as though she were floating through the day, weirdly detached, as though there were glass between her mind and the rest of the world. Hermione went through the motions of healing and then a long evening of brewing. The Order needed a large batch of Draught of Living Death. It was their method for dealing with prisoners. They wouldn't kill him and had neither prisons nor enough people to be able to spare some as guards. So, Death Eaters they caught were kept in an unplottable location in suspended animation. Bill Weasley and his wife Fleur were in charge of it, using the skills as former curse breakers to weave elaborate enchantments and wards in order to accommodate the considerable number of prisoners the Order had accrued over the years. As she sat waiting 2.5 minutes for the potion to settle, she glanced at her watch. It was almost 8 o'clock. She sighed and buried her face in her hands. She did not want to see Malfoy again. If she did, she would probably punch him in his cruel face. He probably wasn't expecting her to show up anyway. Her wand chimed to indicate that the time had passed, and she dropped the last bit of valerian root in. The potion turned pale pink. She warded it and put it carefully aside. She picked up her jar of salve and rolled it about in her hands. She was almost out of essence of Dittany. She used most of it treating his wounds. She tried not to calculate how many other injuries she could have healed with it if she weren't using it on Draco. Tried not to quantify his value against the lives of others. How many he'd saved, how many he'd killed, how many lives his intelligence was or was not worth. He killed Dumbledore. The number of deaths he was responsible for because of that act alone was sufficient to damn him. He'd never rebalance the scales, no matter how many people he saved. Unless he helped them win. If they won, it might be enough. She smiled bitterly at herself. Draco Malfoy was exactly the same person he had been the night before. The only difference was that her knowledge of him had broadened slightly. She couldn't understand him. Why get so angry and monstrous because she didn't want to hurt him when he was already severely injured? He was so unreasonably angry and bitter. It felt as though she'd shattered the fragile peace between them. But provoking her with Colin's death was low, even by her standards for him. Maybe he was actually concerned that she was gonna die. She scoffed at herself. If he were, it were probably only because he didn't want to risk If he were, it was probably only because he didn't want to risk having a non-Oculumens as his contact. Before she could think more, she slipped the solve into her pocket and then headed to the shack. She was 4 minutes early, but being there again felt exhausting. She sat down on the chair and pulled a picture from her pocket. It was of herself, Ron, Harry, and in the Great Hall, all mid-bite and looking up, faintly annoyed over being photographed. Colin had taken it. She always stared at it when she felt depressed. She put it back in her pocket and then leaned across the table and buried her head in her arms. Maybe she would dose herself with dreamless sleep potion when she got back. She could feel the nightmares in the back of her mind, just waiting for an opportunity to claw their way to the surface of her consciousness. She'd already taken the potion 8 times that month. She was still having nightmares from all the victims from the Cursed Development Division that were brought to her. She tried so hard to save them. There had been nothing she could do. Almost every single one had died. Those that didn't, she euthanized, to spare them the endless agony they'd have magically trapped within. If she took dreamless sleep drought, it would be breaking the rule she held everyone else to. Barring injury, no one was permitted more than 8 vials a month. Not that anyone would know. Hermione was the one in charge of regulating the potions. The resistance was too overdrawn to afford the redundancy of having a supervisor over her. Even if they tried to, unless the person had been a potion mastery, there was little chance they could stop Hermione from slyly doing whatever she pleased. But it was a slippery slope to abuse the rules. 9 times a month, it would be easy to rationalize. 10 after that. Then 11. Until it stopped working. Until she wanted something stronger. Severus had warned her the number of ways a potion master could abuse her skills were endless. Maybe when she got home, she'd go get high with Neville or see if Charlie would share his fire whiskey supply. But she didn't really want to get high, and she wasn't allowed to be, even if she did want to. She was always on call in case of a healing emergency. She could get drunk. She always kept sobriety potion carefully stocked in her stores, but she hardly got along with Charlie when she was even sober. Hermione felt desperate for someone to talk to. Almost every interaction with Malfoy felt like an emotional punch in the gut, and she had to walk away from them and pretend that they'd never even happened. She lived in a house crammed with people, and she felt utterly isolated. There was a faint crack of apparition. She looked up dully to find that Malfoy had arrived, cold and indolent looking as always. She wanted to cry and bolt, or to hex him nastily and just leave him there. She swallowed it and stood up. He unbuttoned his shirt and straddled the chair. She didn't say a word as she pulled the fabric off his shoulders and set to work. "I'm going to use the cleansing charm now," she said in a mechanical voice. She counted to 3 and then cast it. Then she swiftly reapplied the salve. The Dittany had made progress in neutralizing the poison. The cuts appeared almost ready to begin healing. She would probably be able to start closing them within the next week. The process would take several hours to do properly and ensure the scar tissue wasn't taut and wouldn't pull when he moved his shoulders. She didn't want to talk to him, but she forced herself to open her mouth. "If you have time in the next 4 to 7 days, I can close the incisions. It'll probably take 3 hours. After 8 p.m. and before 5 a.m. are the best times for me. I have hospital shifts and other duties during the day." He didn't say anything. She recast the protective spells and dropped his shirt over his shoulders. Then she turned and walked out of the shack without a word. The summer evening was cool. She shivered slightly and walked down the lane. She had decided. She was going to get well and truly smashed. She stopped outside a pub and hesitated. She was a talkative drunk. She couldn't go into a muggle pub and start crying about everyone who had died, even if she managed to pass herself off as a doctor in the casualty ward. She was a terrible conversational liar. She continued until she found a market and bought herself a bottle of port. Her parents had always liked to drink port in the evenings when on holiday. She carried it to the creek where her prayer tower stood, and then stared in surprise. There were reeds growing along the banks that she didn't remember being there before, and the area felt slightly warmer, magical. She cast several more muggle-repelling spells and a privacy charm over the area, and then opened the bottle and started drinking. She remembered someone telling her that a person could get drunk faster using a straw. She didn't know if it was true, but she conjured a long one and started sipping. She calculated that she had several hours before anyone would even think to look for her. More than enough time to get drunk, cry under a bridge, and then sober slightly before heading back. She hadn't had any dinner. The alcohol hit her rapidly. She curled up in a ball among the reeds and was sobbing in short order. She hated Malfoy. How dare he demand her and isolate her and talk about the Creevy family? She hoped she was the one who killed him. She stood up and pulled the topmost stone off her tower and tossed it back into the creek. She did it too carelessly. The whole tower wobbled slightly and then fell, crashing into the water. She gasped with horror and tried to rebuild it. Rock stacking required finesse and steadier hands than she currently possessed. After several tries, she gave up, sat down in the middle of the creek, and cried and shivered. She hadn't felt so pathetic in a long time, and she didn't even care. She should have bought 2 bottles of port. The fuck are you doing, Granger? That is the end of chapter 35. A rough one. My hair is so dirty. I'm so sorry, guys. So that was the end of chapter 35. We are at, I'm just marking it so I can put your timestamps in. We are in chapter 36 now. Chapter 36. Here we go. Chapter 36, flashback 11, July 2002. Hermione looked up sharply and found Malfoy staring down at her from the road. She was too tired and angry to even feel embarrassed about being drunk and crying in a creek. "Bugger off, Malfoy," she said, smacking at the water with her hand so it sprayed in his direction. "Are you drunk?" he asked. "No, you tosser. I'm sitting in a creek entirely sober," she said with an eye roll. "Go away. I don't want to talk to you. I don't want to see your nasty face. If I could obliviate your existence from my mind without risking the order, I'd do it in a heartbeat." She started crying again. "Fucking hell," he said, staring down at her with the same expression of irritation he'd had when he told her about the unwanted Manacled he found himself in possession of. "Granger, you cannot sit crying in a creek," he finally said. "I actually can," she retorted. "Aside from you, there's no one to see. I already warded the area. None of the muggles will come around or notice me. I have planned my emotional breakdown carefully, and you are ruining it. So, bugger off." Her head felt very heavy, and she dropped it down onto her knees. It was growing very cold in the creek, but she was determined not to move until Malfoy went away. There was a muffled thud, and then a hard grip suddenly closed around her arm, and she found herself being dragged up out of the water. "Let go!" She smacked Malfoy across the arm and kicked him in the shins as she attempted to wrench herself free. "Leave me alone. You and Voldemort have ruined my life. Am I not even allowed to occasionally feel sad about it?" "Granger, you idiot!" Malfoy dragged her into his arms and apparated. They reappeared in the shack. She stared around the room dazedly, clinging to him for balance. "Why are we here?" she demanded, her voice wobbling as she stepped away and tried to draw herself up. "I hate this place. One of the richest wizarding families in all of Europe, and you make me come see you in this miserable house, as though I'm not already well aware of the disdain you have for all mudbloods. God, why don't you just buy a whorehouse or a salt mine and make me visit you there?" "I told you there was a taboo, and you used the Dark Lord's name," Malfoy snarled. "That is why you cannot get drunk in a fucking creek, regardless of how many damn muggle-repelling charms you cast." Hermione blinked and stared at him. "I hate you," she finally said. "The feeling is decidedly mutual," he said, looking at her with an expression of disdain. She dropped into a heap on the floor. "I hate you so much," she said. "I was already all alone. Then you demanded me and made it even worse. At least before, if everyone cared enough to ask me if I was all right, I could tell the truth. But now, I can't even do that. And now, even if we win, I won't have anything to look forward to. Everyone else will be free and also be owned by you. I'm just going to be alone forever. She buried her face in her hands and cried afresh. Harry and Ron are never going to forgive me, she said, and her whole body shook with the force of her sobs. Even if this wins the war, they'll never forgive me. Her crying subsided slightly after several minutes. I'm not really clear on why you expect me to care. Malfoy stared down at her with an indifferent expression. She glared up at him. You brought me here knowing that I was drunk. If you didn't want to hear about it, you could have just left me alone the way I repeatedly told you to. I don't see why you just won't fuck off. He arched an eyebrow. Hexing and swearing at me all in one day. It would seem I finally got to you. I wonder what it would take to make you give up your sweet caresses and tell me how you really felt. His expression was taunting. Shut up, she snarled before dropping her head onto her knees and hugging herself. But really, we're just scratching the surface, aren't we? Perhaps I should list everyone I've killed, he said, stepping slowly around her with a malicious smile. There were several muggles first, practice runs before I went back to school. Aunt Bella said it was necessary to be used to killing before doing it someone I actually knew. Then Dumbledore, and more muggles. Did you know I was even assigned to find your parents? You must have hidden them yourself because there wasn't even a trace to be found. No sloppy details or secret goodbyes like many of the other muggle-born families. Although that ignorance still didn't spare your neighbors. Bella was crushed by how thorough you were. Hermione was staring at him in horror. Then the Creevies and the Finch-Fletchleys. Sorry, I don't know how to say it. Finch-Fletchleys. And my aunt Andromeda and her husband Ted. That one was rather personal for Bella. Having a muggle-born marry into the Black family was such a stain. It remained her sincerest regret that she never got to kill Nymphadora, especially after word got around that she'd gone and married a werewolf. Then after that, well, the dead tend to bleed together after a while, but I believe it was more muggles. Hermione could feel the warm fuzziness of her intoxication draining away from her as Malfoy kept talking, listing name after familiar name, the glint of his silver eyes and cold set expression on his face as he continued in his disdainful, drawling voice. You know, Malfoy, she said quietly after a minute, you spend so much time making sure I have just an excess of good reasons to hate you. It's odd. He paused and she stared at him. It's not how humans work, she said. Our brains are wired to rationalize things so that the guilt doesn't eat us up. We excuse, we blame, we find some explanation for ourselves that help us sleep. People don't think of themselves as villains. They're killing to protect themselves or their families or their money or their way of life. Even your master, he doesn't think he's a villain. He just thinks he's better than everyone else. He thinks he deserves to rule over everything. When he tortures and kills muggles, it's all right because they're not really people. When he carved runes into your back for hours, it was all right. You deserved it because you failed him. In his mind, he isn't a villain. He's a god. But you think you're a villain. You think you deserve to be hated. She cocked her head to the side as she studied him. I often wonder why that is. Malfoy's face had grown colder and more closed as she was speaking. I'll save you all the effort, she said, and her mouth quirked up at the corner. I hate you. I don't require you to do anything more to convince me. I hate you. More than anyone else aside from your master. I hate you. I hold you partly responsible for every person who has died so far in this war and every person who will die. You don't need to convince me that you're a monster. I already know it. Healing you when you're injured is not because of my bleeding heart. And not hexing you when you're severely wounded isn't sentiment. It's simply the last bit of decency I have left. All the rest of my goodness has already been destroyed by you. So, despite what you fling in my face, I will not let you have it. Now, fuck off. Goodness, it felt nice to have finally gotten that off my chest. She'd probably regret saying it all later, but in the moment, she only felt relief. Malfoy smirked faintly. Good to know. Hermione laid back on the floor and stared at the ceiling. After several minutes of silence, it was clear he was not going to go away. She gave up driving him off. She was overwhelmed by her desire to talk. She sat on the floor. What are you like, drunk, Malfoy? She said, turning her head to look at him. He was standing beside her and staring down where she sat at his feet. He looked surprised by the question. Quieter. And angrier. She snorted. Of course. Heaven forbid you'd be anything interesting. I didn't have you down as a weepy drunk. He raised an eyebrow and conjured a chair, which he straddled beside her. It occurred to her that he probably couldn't lean against anything. She wondered how much it might have hurt to pull her out of the creek and then apparate when she was struggling and trying to fight him off. I wasn't always, she said wistfully. Talkative, always. But alcohol makes me emotional. I used to be a happy drunk. I was just ridiculous. I went to a party where the punch was spiked and I got so smashed. Harry had to silence me while he and Ron were dragging me through the halls. I was giggling so uncontrollably, peals of laughter just bouncing off the walls. Filch nearly caught us. When was that? He asked. My birthday. I turned 17. It was the day before you killed Dumbledore. Her jaw trembled slightly, and she looked down at her fingers as they traced a knothole on the floor. I was supposed to have been in the hallway the next day. Prefect duty to help the first years. But I was so hungover, I slept late. I've often wondered if it would have made any difference. It wouldn't have, he said. I've always cried since then. Always. Not that I get drunk often. I tend to say things that piss people off. You always do that, he said, giving her a pointed look. I say more things that piss people off, she amended. Anyway, tonight it was drunk or high or abusing potions. And the creek. I don't have anywhere to go. I can't go to a pub or get drunk around anyone in the order. It's not like Moody is a shoulder to cry on. Potter and Weasley? Since they don't know about you, how would I explain anything? She wasn't going to mention that they had gone off without her to hunt Horcruxes. I can't believe you couldn't just leave me alone, she said. Why were you even there? I had a feeling you were going to do something asinine. Call it a sixth sense. She rolled her eyes. I don't see why you'd care. Your secret would die with me. I'm sure you'll still find a way to get whatever it is you want without me. I'm sure anyone Moody sent to try to replace you with would be only more irritating, he said, faced with a grimace. Think of it as an additional favor to your order. I'm keeping their healer and potion mistress alive. She snorted. She started to feel incredibly sleepy. The thought of sleeping made her think of Colin. Tears welled up in her eyes. She covered her face with her hands and sobbed. What now? Sorry. What now? Malfoy said as her sobs subsided. He sounded bored, but when she looked at him, he glanced away. He'd been watching her. I'm going to dream about Colin tonight, she said sadly, dropping her head against her knees. You were delusional when you said you could ever kill anyone. You can't even handle them dying at someone else's hand, he said, shaking his head dismissively. Hermione stiffened and stared up at Malfoy. I don't think there's anything particularly awful about dying. I know it's war. People die, she said. What I care about is the manner. You have no idea, Malfoy, what it's like to have someone die while you are doing everything in your power to save them. He died slowly, screaming the whole time, and I was trying to save him. That's what haunts me. All those deaths in my mind, that's the type they were. That's why they haunt me. They were in my hands. I was trying to save them, and I failed. She choked slightly, and her voice creaked at the final words. Malfoy looked at her and seemed considering for the first time. Why does Colin matter so much? You weren't close. Why is that death the one that still remains so significant to you? You've seen worse deaths since then. She hesitated. She had never spoken about it to anyone. Not really. Not for years. His death was the beginning of the end of everything, she said, looking down and noticing a snag thread on her shirt. She tugged impulsively at it and watched the knitted fabric tighten and bunch until the thread suddenly snapped and a hole appeared. She repaired it with a flick of her wand. He was the first person who died entirely under my care. Harry saw it happened. And after that, I realized that what the Order was doing wasn't enough. That defense wasn't enough. And I started saying so. But Harry disagreed. To him, dying is the worst thing. It's leaving. So, killing in any way is evil. Self-defense, mercy killing, any kind. That disagreement sent us in different directions in the war. Nothing was the same after that. That's why I ended up a healer while everyone else went to the battlefield together. Somewhat ironic. One person using dark arts in the battlefield isn't enough to make a difference. And if I'd been insubordinate and tried to recruit people into my thinking, it might have split the Order. If you were fighting again, how would you kill? Quick. There are spells to stop hearts, curses that suffocate, slicing hexes to the throat. I'd do it like that. I'd probably even use the killing curse if I had it in me, but Harry would probably never forgive it. How does Potter plan to defeat the Dark Lord? If there's a prophecy. Harry thinks the answer is the prophecy, she said vaguely. She wasn't sure if the power of love was real Order strategy, but Malfoy didn't need to know the details. Fantastic. We're all betting our lives on the boy who won't kill and a prophecy. We are doomed. Dumbledore defeated Grindelwald without killing him, Hermione said. Malfoy looked unimpressed. Where did you study healing? He asked her. She looked over at him with surprise. France at first, she said, but the war crossed the channel quickly, and it was safer for me to transfer than risk being found there. So I went to Albania. Their old magic department had the best fundamentals for healing dark magic. I was there for a while. That's where I learned the treatment I've used on your runes. You're lucky. I'm probably one of the only healers left who know the treatment since the hospital was destroyed. Then Denmark for spell analysis and deconstruction. After that, I went to Egypt. Their hospital was the most specialized for curse breaking, but the situation was unstable, so I got transferred to Austria within a few weeks. I was in Austria until the Order brought me back. A lot of people thought you died or ran, Malfoy said, studying her with hooded eyes. Until the Dark Lord wanted to know why the Resistance was surviving after their hospital was razed, and Severus mentioned that Potter's little mudblood friend had been recalled from her journey abroad. Healer and potion mistress to boot. It caused a slight stir among the upper ranks. She looked at him sharply. So he'd known what she was when he made his demands. She wondered if that had played a part in any of his decisions. The conversation stalled. After a few more minutes, Hermione stood up. I'm sober enough to apparate now. You're not going to go off and get drunk somewhere else, are you? He asked, staring at her suspiciously. She shook her head. No. You have quite thoroughly killed my buzz, and I'm sufficiently cried out. He looked faintly relieved. Don't splint yourself, he drawled after her as she went out the door. Hermione didn't. When she got back to Grimmauld Place, she went up to her potion cabinet and downed a sobriety potion. The headache and nausea promptly dropped down upon her with a subtlety of a sledgehammer. She dropped her head down into the worktop and groaned. Trust Draco Malfoy to not even allow her to get drunk in peace, sodding bastard. She had expected sobriety to fill her with horror, but she felt surprisingly unrepentant for finally lashing out at him. It certainly hadn't seemed to surprise or upset him. He'd been waiting for it. She found herself entirely at a loss about how to interpret or process all that had occurred. She'd fumbled through the cabinet for a vial of headache relief and downed it, trying to focus. Draco thought of himself as a villain. That was an important realization. Possibly the most important one she had yet to make regarding him. The inconsistency that was in the heart of him. She racked her mind replaying everything he'd said that day. Now that she'd vented all her rage at him, her mind felt suddenly crystal clear. Then the littler one stepped in a badger hole and broke his leg. He started crawling through the grass. Quite an easy target for a killing curse. The second person I cursed in the back with it. You know, the killing curse, it takes something out of you. It's not something just anyone can throw around, not repeatedly. Colin could have kept running. If he had, he might still be alive today, but he stopped for his dead brother. He stopped, ran back, and tried to drag the body with him. Hermione froze. He could have killed Dennis Creevey in an innumerable number of crueler, slower ways than the killing curse. With a broken leg, Dennis was no flight risk. He would have been the perfect lure to draw Colin back. But rather than just stand over injured Dennis and catch both boys, Draco had killed him humanely. Possibly in the hope that a dead brother would drive Colin off and spare his life. Hermione felt ready to fall over at the dual realization that struck her. Malfoy had been trying to spare Colin. But possibly of greater significance for Hermione, Malfoy didn't regard that detail as redeeming. He'd been certain she'd become completely mindless with hatred for him once she'd known he'd been involved at all. The unintended admission that he'd been trying to let the boys escape wasn't a way of trying to excuse himself. She suspected he didn't even register it as such. Malfoy considered himself a villain because of what he did, which implied that he didn't want to do it. Which implied that his desire to aid the order might be sincere and not merely a means to some other end. Hermione drummed her fingers on the worktop thoroughly, reevaluating once more everything she thought she knew of Draco Malfoy. And that is the end of chapter 36, and we are about to enter our final chapter, chapter 37. Final chapter in this episode, chapter 37, flashback 12, August 2002. Find each person's handle, his weak point. The art of moving people's wills involves more skill than determination. You must know how to get inside the other person. First, size up someone's character and then touch on his weak point. Hermione stayed up half the night reanalyzing Draco. She scrapped her entire notebook and started a new one. She felt as though she were brimming with new theories about him. She wasn't sure if any of them were based on reality or merely brought on by her sleep deprivation, but she felt as though she had hit upon something, as though she were breaking into a muggle vault and finally heard the first tumbler click into place. A warm sense of elation made her smile to herself while she brewed potions that day. Her heart felt almost light. This could work. She could win. She could bring him to heel. Seal his loyalty. She hadn't realized how much that belief that he was simply a monster with a moral code had convinced her that she could never succeed. She'd had a sense of certainty that eventually he'd turn and kill her along with everyone else. It had been so entrenched. Despite her heavy reliance upon occlumency, the conviction had bled into how she thought and treated him as a whole. Despite the game they played, he'd kissed her and taught her occlumency. He told her she could say no, and she healed him and followed his instructions about dueling and exercises. Beneath the learning and the partial niceties, it always felt like they were two vipers waiting for each other to strike. Now she was reconsidering. He was not a monster. Not entirely. He was trying to fix something. There was some sort of amends that he was trying to make. Not for killing Dumbledore or anyone else, but for something. He knew he was fallen. Somewhere along the way, something had happened that he was willing to suffer for, even die because of. Something he was trying to make right. He wasn't a spy out of ambition. He wasn't just playing the Order and the Death Eater against each other in order to come out on top. He was trying to fix something. Not the war, not the killing, but there was something he was trying to make amends for. Her initial assessment had been right. Draco Malfoy wasn't all ice. Under the death, rage, and darkness, there was more to him. She could use it. He doubted he'd tell her what was driving him. He was clearly determined not to reveal it, playing a game of misdirection until her head spun. But she could be patient. Now that she had figured out that spying was some sort of penance for something, if she refused to really hate him now, if she continued to be kind and comforting and interesting and clever to him, she could find a way in. She could win. As evening drew on and she got ready to go tend to his back, she took a moment to pause and steady herself. She'd have to start over again. There was something between them that she had difficulty letting herself think about too carefully. A tension between them that she likely wrecked with her outburst. She had to begin cultivating it again carefully. She had to be subtle. Subtle as poison. Hermione closed her eyes and shifted through her memories, winnowing out her strongest feelings and setting them aside. Tamping down on her elation, on her bubbly sense of inner confidence, stifling them until she was clear-headed, focused. She apparated to the shack 1 minute before 8. When Malfoy appeared, she stared at him for a moment before dropping her eyes, biting her lip, and awkwardly fidgeting with her cuticles. "Sorry," she mumbled. "You were right. I was careless last night. It won't happen again." She looked up through her lashes to see Malfoy, if Malfoy was even remotely convinced by the apology. "Good," he said, staring across the room. "I'm not your keeper. I'm not interested in having to monitor you in order to keep you alive." "It won't happen again," she reiterated. He eyed her for a moment and then looked away, summoning a chair from across the room and straddling it while starting to unbutton his shirt. Hermione drew it off his shoulder and surveyed the runes. She rested her fingers lightly on the top of his shoulder as she leaned forward to get a better look. Malfoy didn't flinch when she touched him. He tensed, though, slightly. "Do you have time when you want me to close the incisions?" she asked in a low voice as she used her fingers and wand to ease the salve out and inspected the raw edges of the cuts. It still looked unbearably painful. She wasn't sure how Malfoy was even functioning, much less apparating, much less dueling. Every time she saw the wounds, it made her cringe. He didn't say anything. She rested her hand on his spine. I'm going to use the cleansing charm now. She felt Malfoy tense under her hand and saw his knuckles whiten slightly. She counted to 3 and cast. His whole body shook faintly. I'm sorry, she said. If there were any way for me to repair this faster or at least relieve the pain, I would. I am aware, he said in a tight voice. She applied the salve as lightly as she could. Would Monday work? She asked, drawing her fingertips along his bare shoulders, trying to get him to release the pain tension that radiated through him. I can skip dinner if you need me to come earlier. Monday, he said after a pause. 8 is fine. All right. She cast the protective spells. Then she studied the runes again, brushing her fingers near them. She could barely feel the magic in them. It had sunk in, become a part of him. She could barely feel any dark magic around him at all. Not anymore. Not for weeks. Do you feel the runes? She asked. Can you tell if they're affecting you? He seemed to be considering. Yes, he said after a moment, straightening. They don't countermand my own behavior, but it's as though new elements have been written in. It's easier to be ruthless, somewhat harder to dissuade myself from impulses. Not that I had much distracting me before, but now everything else feels less consequential. Hermione read the vow again. Did you know when he was cutting them which runes he was choosing? She asked. I chose them, he said, pulling his shirt up and rebuttoning them. Hermione looked at him, stunned. It was my penance. I already had to grovel. If I chose them, I was able to ensure he wasn't going to insert anything problematic. That's why there are so many. I didn't want to leave any room for additional promises. He had to be convinced of my remorse, he said as he stood up. His eyes reminded Hermione of a storm. Although, he said, and his lip curled faintly, the rage in his eyes becoming obvious, he failed to mention that they would take so long to heal after that fact. In retrospect, I should have anticipated that additional punishment. When I close them, it will take a while in order to ensure the scar tissue won't restrict your movement. You'll have to stay awake to tell me. You may want to bring something to drink. Malfoy's eyes narrowed, and he stared at Hermione for several seconds. I'm not going to drink around you, Granger. She shrugged. It's just a suggestion. I'll bring something in case you change your mind, but I imagine the alcohol I can afford is more inexpensive than you'll appreciate. He snorted. I'll keep it in mind. He vanished without another word. The following night, he was in a tetchy mood, and Hermione refrained from speaking to him as she treated him. However, she noticed that he had begun relaxing slightly into her touch. She doubted he was even conscious of it. Hermione, for her part, had realized that she had grown comfortable with him. With the taint of dark magic no longer hanging around him, her instinctive fear had faded. She didn't hesitate to touch him, didn't experience any tingle of dread in her spine. She no longer tensed, bracing herself that he might lash out. He felt familiar. On Saturday, a soothing charm finally stuck to the incisions when she cast it, and Draco shuddered significantly less when she cast the cleansing charm. The venom is finally gone, she said with relief. She summoned her satchel over and dug through it for an angelistic potion that she had developed. She drew some cloths out and, after placing a barrier spell on her hand so that it wouldn't go numb, poured an angelistic out until the fabric was drenched. This will feel cold and sting for a moment, but then it will numb the incisions, he said. I'm going to start on the top of your left shoulder. She rested her fingers just above the first rune for a second before she gently laid the cloth over his shoulder and lightly pressed it against the incisions underneath. He shivered. She set a timer for the left shoulder and turned to attend to the right. They shouldn't hurt now, but they've still open wounds on your back, she said. Don't go do something stupid like getting into a fight with a werewolf just because you aren't in an agonizing pain anymore, okay? Will you sign off on my werewolf fighting Tuesday? He asked in a snide voice. Hermione rolled her eyes. I'd advise giving the scar tissue at least 3 days to set before fighting any werewolves. He chuckled faintly. The conversation stalled after that, but the evening ended on a surprisingly cordial note. Hermione was in a somewhat cheerful mood when she apparated back to Grimmauld Place. As she landed on the steps, her bracelet suddenly grew hot. She flung the door open and found it in chaos. There was blood smeared across the floor. Hermione! Neville shouted, it's Ginny! Hermione bolted up the steps as quickly as she could, avoiding the blood spilled across the floor. Harry, Ron, and all the other resident Weasleys were there. Pomfrey and Padma were hovering over a bed where Ginny was laying. What happened? She demanded, dropping her satchel and rushing over. Ginny was unconscious and had a large, ragged gash along her face. Blood was pouring out of it. Necrosis curse hit her on the cheek, Pomfrey said between spells. They cut it out as quick as they could, but we've never had anyone make it back after being struck in the head. Padma, blood replenishing potion, Hermione barked as she cast her own spells. Brain damage was not one of Hermione's specialties. Normally, when curses reached the brain, the damage was beyond healing. She cast the most complex brain scan spells she knew and studied them. It didn't reach her brain, she gasped with relief. Then she cast another diagnostic over Ginny's head. The ragged, hurried cuts made it hard to read any other details. She couldn't see any obvious indicators of remaining necrosis, but Hermione didn't trust fate to be kind. She snatched Pomfrey's wand from her hand without asking, muttered a charm, and began using the second wand tip, delved into the diagnostic layers, looking for any remaining traces of the rot hiding beneath all the tissue damage. She was reading from the removal process. There's necrosis in her zygomatic and frontal bones. I have to remove them now, Hermione said. Everyone out! There was protesting, which she ignored as she cast more blood-staunching spells, trying to see everything exactly where the curse was still eating into Ginny. Give her 1 drop of Drought of the Living Dead, she ordered Padma, who had just poured blood-replenishing potion down Ginny's throat. It will slow the recovery, but we can't risk her moving. Hermione grit her teeth and prayed as she summoned potions from the cabinet and began to cast a series of intricate spells and wards over Ginny's head, many of which she had never used before or only used once. Trying to remove any section of the skull was horrendously risky in any situation, but far worse than trying to accomplish it rapidly. It was going to expose the sinuses. Ginny would lose her entire eye socket, and part of her frontal lobe would be exposed until the bones grew back. Staring at the black spots on Ginny's exposed skull that were now growing before her eyes, Hermione cast a hair removal charm and then spread a thick purple potion very carefully around the edge of the gash and then out across more than half of Ginny's head and face. When it was carefully and evenly spread, Hermione cast a setting charm. The potion grew hard and shell-like, an exoskeleton. Hermione took a steadying breath and banished each section of Ginny's skull. The exoskeleton potion externally held the areas which no longer had bone structure supporting them. Hermione recast the diagnostic and checked repeatedly and thoroughly. The necrosis was gone. The bones had been removed before the curse reattached itself through to Ginny's brain. Hermione collapsed slightly. I felt tempted to sob with relief. It had been so close. So very close. Closer than she would ever even tell anyone. She steadied her hands and administered Skelligro. She added several monitored wards and several more protective wards around Ginny's exposed brain. Then she set a timer. With the interference of Drought of the Living Death, the bone regrowth would take 10 hours. She couldn't start repairing the gash until the bones had regrown completely, or the repaired tissue would have nothing to form over. Ginny would carry a cruel-looking scar for the rest of her life. But she would live. Whoever had cut out the necrosis had done it quick enough to save her. Hermione took Ginny's hand in her own and stroked it gently. She was covered in blood. Hermione cast cleansing charms across Ginny's body and changed her into hospital robes with a few flicks of her wand. Then Hermione cast diagnostic charms over the rest of Ginny to ensure she wasn't injured anywhere else. There was a scrape on her calf and bruising on one arm. Hermione fixed that in minutes. Hermione stood and picked up both of the wands beside her. Sorry, she said, handing Poppy her wand back. Grabbing a person's wand without permission was grossly offensive. Poppy stashed her wand with a shaken expression. I had already cast 4 diagnostics before you came, and none of them showed the remaining bone necrosis. I've never seen a diagnostic dissected compositionally before. I am glad you didn't waste time asking permission. I read about it in a book on healing theory. Brain diagnostics are difficult. There's so much activity that the magic picks up. They're hard for even the specialists to read quickly. It was just luck. It worked. Hermione sighed and wanted to sit down. Now that the crisis had been passed, she was able to feel her heart pounding and her hands shaking. She felt lightheaded and on the verge of falling over backwards. I should go let everyone know that she's all right, Hermione said shakily. Harry and Ron and almost everyone in Grimmauld Place were waiting outside the doors of the hospital ward. She's all right, Hermione said as she opened the door. She'll be all right. Harry gave a sob and slumped back against the wall. Oh, thank Merlin, Charlie muttered. Ron rubbed his eyes, and Hermione saw blood on his hands and all over his clothing. She approached him and cast a subtle diagnostic as she did. He was uninjured. It was all Ginny's blood. Did you remove the necrosis? She asked Ron. He nodded. His pale blue eyes flooded briefly with tears. His whole body was shaking as though he were going into shock. You saved her, Ron, she said, pulling him down to a hug. You bought her enough time to get back. If you hadn't, it might have been too late, or she might have lost her eye. She'll have a scar, but she's going to be fine. Oh, Merlin. Ron collapsed slightly in Hermione's arm. Lucius showed up. We apparated, but when we landed, we realized Ginny was hit. When I saw it, he dragged his hands across his eyes and it smeared blood across his pale skin. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. All I could think of is when Dad came back after George, and now Gin and I. She looked at me, and I knew I had to try. It was worse than anything. Ron sobbed and buried his head into Hermione's shoulder. She wrapped her arms around him tightly. I just kept trying to tell myself it was to save her, he mumbled into her shoulder. Mom, I promised Mom I'd keep her safe. Told her I'd never let anything happen to Gin. You did save her, Hermione said into his ear. You did exactly what you needed to do. I'm going to kill the Malfoys, he muttered into her ear. Lucius and Malfoy. I'm going to kill them both. I don't care if I have to wait until after the war to do it. That family deserves to die. Hermione didn't let the circle she was rubbing into Ron's shoulders falter. She just hugged him tighter. The oath to kill the Malfoys was an increasingly common refrain among the Weasleys. The primary exception to the firm opposition to killing. It had started after Dumbledore's death, but grown more frequent after Bill returned from a mission, dragging his wailing father with him. Lucius Malfoy made a point of identifying himself immediately after cursing Arthur with some obscure spell that had resulted in giving Arthur the mental capacity of a toddler. Hermione had gone through every healing manual and obscure book of curses that she could get her hands upon, but she never managed to find out what the curse was or any means by which to reverse or lessen the effects. In some ways, Hermione sometimes guiltily thought it was worse than if Arthur had died, which was probably what Lucius had intended. Arthur Weasley was gone, except not. His friendly, curious, affectionate self remained, trapped in the body of a middle-aged man and a child's mind. He needed to be watched constantly. He would only mind a few people and was prone to having explosions of accidental magic and minor seizures when upset. His effective loss was a staggering dual setback for the Order. Molly had to step away almost entirely to care for her husband full-time. She had taken him to live at one of the hospice safe houses. When George was able to leave the hospital ward at Grimmauld Place, he had joined his mother in helping to care for his father. You are a good brother, Hermione murmured to Ron. When his shaking finally eased, she pulled back slightly in order to ask the question pressing in her mind. Ron, can you tell me what you used to remove the necrosis? Was it spell work or a knife? A knife. One of the ones from Harry's vault, he said. Can I see it? She asked steadily. Sure, Ron said, somewhat confused. He glanced around, looking slightly dazed still. I think it's downstairs. Neville has our stuff. Hermione stepped back and poked her head into the hospital ward. Poppy, can you check Harry and Ron for injuries and administer a draught of peace, double for Ron? I need to check something. Hermione made her way downstairs. Neville and Hannah Abbott were mopping up the floor with magic. Nev, can you show me Ron's rucksack? He nodded toward the corner. It's the one with all the blood on it. I haven't cleaned it yet. Hermione went over and started going through it carefully. The contents had been flung in haphazardly. There was blood drawing on everything. Shoved in an outer pocket, she caught sight of a knife handle. She pulled it out carefully. It was goblin wrought, as she had suspected. She carried it into the kitchen and washed the blood off. Then she pulled a small piece of raw chicken from the stasis bin and ran the entire blade of the knife lightly across the meat. The magically sharp edge sliced effortlessly. Then Hermione laid the knife carefully aside and stared down at the chicken. A minute passed, then 2. Hermione wondered if she'd been mistaken. Then a small speck of darkness appeared on the chicken. Hermione stared and watched it as it slowly grew larger and larger over the next several minutes. Hermione cast a stasis charm, but it had no effect on the rot, steadily spreading across the meat. She cast a barrier charm on the blade of the knife and several protective wards. Then she wrapped it in several towels and put a repelling charm on the whole thing. Then she placed it in a drawer, which she locked and booby-trapped with several stinging hexes and an alarm. She turned and went back up to the hospital ward. Harry was sitting next to Ginny, holding her hand. His eyes were huge and devastated, with his face was pale. He was chewing nervously on his lip. When Hermione laid her hand lightly on his shoulder, he started and looked sharply up at her. He smiled thinly, a hospital smile. A rictus, the faint, wane tightening across a face that givers made with the intention of appearing encouraging or stalwart, but which always just looked fractured. When Ginny woke up, she would wear the same expression when she reassured everyone that she was fine, that she didn't mind the scar, that she was really fine. Hermione smiled sadly down at Harry and conjured a chair in order to join him. She shouldn't have come, Harry said after a minute. The Order decided what the best unit would be. She wasn't there because of you two, Hermione said. Lucius's grudge doesn't have anything to do with whether you or Ginny are together. I'm going to have to tell them not to pair us anymore, Harry said, looking up from Ginny's hand to stare into the distance. His expression was dazed, and his bright emerald eyes didn't seem to see the hospital ward. Hermione recognized this expression. He was back on the mission, reliving it over and over in order to berate himself over what had gone wrong. It was all my fault, he said, his voice small, quavering slightly. I should have put the wards up sooner. The mission was so easy. Pointless. It was like a trip with her and Ron, like we were camping for fun. I let my guard down. Hermione said nothing. It was a confession. He was so stunned and grieved that he had things he needed to say. He just needed to verbalize it. He couldn't tell Ron. He felt too guilty to direct it at Ginny beside him. Hermione had listened to a lot of confessions from those on bedside vigil in the hospital ward. Sometimes she felt like a priest. After we got away, when I saw it on her face, I froze, he said after several moments of silence. When I saw she'd been hit, I didn't. She started crying, and Ron stunned her, and I was just standing there. I just stood there while he was cutting her face up. I barely snapped out of it enough to apparate us back. Rod had to do almost everything. It was just like Colin. I just stood there. No one could have saved Colin, Hermione said quietly. I could have helped save Ginny, Harry snapped, suddenly furious. What if she had died and I'd just been standing there? The woman I love, my best friend's sister. I just stood there and watched her face rot. He dropped Ginny's hand and shoved his glasses up, rubbing his eyes. What if she died or become like Arthur because I was careless and didn't put the wards up? Hermione's voice was trembling. Harry's voice was trembling, and his hands were clenched into fists. Hermione could feel the magic shivering around him as his guilt and emotions continued to grow. Hermione summoned a flagon of calming draught and just transfigured a piece of cotton dressing into a cup, which she filled. She held it and waited for a moment in which to give it to Harry. As she handed it over too soon, it would be thrown into the wall. "No one responds perfectly every time," she said. "It can't happen," Harry said. "I'm not going to risk it." Hermione said nothing, and after a minute, Harry slumped against her. She slipped the cup of calming draught into his hand. Then she rested her head on top of his. "She's going to be all right," she said. "I promise. She's all right." Harry nodded, and Hermione gave herself a moment to just be with him, her best friend. Most days, it felt as though they lived in separate worlds. The boy who saved her from a troll, who she'd brewed a polyjuice potion for, who she traveled back in time with in order to save his godfather, the friend she taught the Accio spell, who she'd set up Dumbledore's army with. He carried on as a hero, but somehow Hermione's path had split off from his. He turned to her as a healer, but rarely as a friend. She laced her fingers through his chaotic hair. "Ginny's in love with you, you know," she said. "Don't push her away. Don't do that to her. Don't do that to yourself. You've already both in danger because of this war. You shouldn't give up the happiness you have. Don't let Tom take that from you." Harry didn't say anything, but he drowned the draught of peace while he kept staring at Ginny. "Can she hear me?" he asked after several minutes, his voice sad and hopeful. "No, sorry. I put her in a stasis until her bones regrew, and I can fix the cut. It would be dangerous for her to move when her brain is exposed. She'll be awake tomorrow." They sat together in silence for several minutes until a silvery bulldog came barreling into the hospital ward. "Potter, Granger, mission debrief in 5 minutes, growled Moody's voice before the Patronus vanished. Harry sighed and stood up. "I guess I'll see you in there," he said, stroking Ginny's hand one last time. Hermione watched him walk out and then turned to Ginny. She cast a few diagnostics to confirm that everything was stable and regrowing the way it was supposed to. Then she went downstairs and got the knife out of the kitchen drawer before going to the dining room where the order meetings were held. Remus and Tonks were already there and smiled at Hermione when she entered and found her seat. Bill walked in a few minutes later. He and Fleur alternated meeting attendance so that one of them was always monitoring the prison. Charlie followed, still looking as pale as he had been when Hermione had announced that Ginny would be all right. Neville entered next, followed by Amelia Bones, then Ron and Harry. Kingsley Shacklebolt and Alistair Moody entered behind them. It was less than a quarter of the current order. Only a handful of members were informed about the Horcruxes. The order had learned through hard experience the danger of letting too many know too much when their opponent was an accomplished Legamans. Molly and Minerva rarely attended any meetings, although they were technically still in an intelligence tier high enough to receive all information. Severus only attended top-level meetings scheduled with more advanced warning. "Harry, Ron, we'd like a full report on your Horcrux hunt," Kingsley said without preamble. "There's nothing to report," Harry said flatly. "We went all the way to Albania and couldn't find anything. We didn't see anyone or have any trouble until Lucius showed up." "How did Lucius find you?" Moody asked, his eyes rolling across Harry and Ron slowly. "I don't know," Harry said. "We just started to set up camp. The wards weren't up, but we've been there less than 15 minutes. Where were you?" "Somewhere either in France or Belgium, I think. Some forest. We were planning to apparate back the rest of the way tomorrow." There were several seconds of silence. "Do you have anything else to report?" Kingsley asked. Harry and Ron looked at each other and shook their heads. Everyone's expression hardened in disappointment. Hermione took a deep breath and steeled herself. There was a chance that she was just being pessimistic, but given her track record in the order meeting, she was not feeling particularly hopeful about the reaction to what she was going to announce. "I have something to report," she said quietly. And that is the end of chapter 37. So you're going to have to hear and wait to see what Hermione reports for chapter 38 when we get back from Plymouth. So that is the end of, now we're into Aftercare. That is the end of chapters 35, 36, 37. A lot happened. I think that this aftercare, it's hard to do by yourself, but I think that there's some, I think that there's a lot of information that's been given. I think there's a lot of things that I hope you hearken back to from volume 1, remembering certain things that Draco either said or did. I think a really good one that I forgot to mention last time was when Hermione during volume 1 was having those muscle spasms in her hands and in her arms from being like, the ligaments and being sort of tortured. Malfoy used very specific skills to like massage her with magic, with a wand. You remember that? And we see him doing that again. We also see, I think in general, you're going to continuously see pieces fall into place in certain places, and also you still don't really fully have a full grasp of what's going on. So I don't want to spoil anything, but if you have any questions, concerns, anything you want to ask, you can always put it in the comment section on YouTube, in our book horror section of Discord, or come into stream Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, starting stream at 10:30 p.m. Eastern, and you could always ask the questions there. Our next episode won't be for about a week, and that will be chapters 38, 39, and 40. So I'm really excited. Thank you so much for watching. I'm sorry if I was a little bit lower energy today. My friggin' leg hurts. But I'm glad that we were able to give you guys this episode, and I hope you enjoyed it so much. It was an emotional one. I love you guys, and I'll see you on YouTube, and I'll see you in stream.